Welcome to the University of Maryland, Baltimore 2020 Researcher of the Year ceremony. This program is being recorded and will be posted on the UMB website, umaryland.edu. Later in the program, following the awardees' presentation, the audience will have an opportunity to ask questions. Please identify the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Select Chat with Host and write your question there. When the time comes, listen for your name. Your mic will be unmuted for you. Now, please welcome University of Maryland, Baltimore President, Dr. Bruce Jarrell.
Welcome to our 25th Founders Week celebration. Today we're celebrating the UMB Researcher of the Year. This program, Founders Week, was begun 25 years ago by then President David Ramsey. And it was a way for us to celebrate the UMB community, our successes, the bright luminary stars, and to show our commitment to research, to education, to public service, and certainly our newly found interest in entrepreneurial spirit led by the Biopark and many of our faculty members. It's such a pleasure to have an old friend, Jay Magaziner, to be presenting this. And although I'm sure I know some about this program, I look forward to learning a whole lot. Here to introduce Dr. Magaziner is Dr. Al Reese, who is Dean of the School of Medicine and Executive Vice President for Medical Affairs at UMB. Dean Reese.
This is an exciting moment, exciting day, and exciting time. And it's my delight to join you this afternoon to honor this year's UMB's Founders Week Researcher of the Year, Dr. Jay Magaziner, the Professor and Chair of the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health in the School of Medicine. By way of brief introduction, Dr. Magaziner also serves as Interim Director of the Division of Gerontology in the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health. He serves also as the Director of the School of Medicine's Center for Research on Aging and is the co-director of the University of Maryland Claude D. Pepper Older Americans Independent Center. Dr. Magaziner's many years of serious, scholarly, and distinguished research have more than qualified him for this prestigious award. His wonderful collegial and collaborative style makes this honor all the more well-deserved. Dr. Magaziner is one of the country's leading scholars and experts in the epidemiology of aging. This establishment of the entire University of Maryland aging research would not have been so successful without Dr. Magaziner and his extraordinary investment of time and intellect in this program. Therefore, one of the reasons making him most deserving of this honor. In particular, his work focusing on hip fracture recovery has earned him 2 consecutive merit awards from the National Institute on Aging. And for those who may not be familiar with merit awards, let me just make the statement that these are special and unique awards, given not upon request or upon application, but rather from the NIH's determination that the investigator's research has produced the highest quality of work, and so they will award a grant in a period of 10 years. Dr. Magaziner is the only person that I know who has received 2 consecutive merit awards. In addition to Dr. Magaziner's extraordinary research, he also directs an NIH T32 training grant for young scholars in the epidemiology of aging. At the present time, his current grant portfolio in the School of Medicine exceeds $20 million. Dr. Magaziner has published extensively in the international literature. He's recognized in his serving as an editorial board member and also as deputy editor of the journal Gerontology Medical Sciences. Dr. Magaziner's far-reaching work demonstrates our School of Medicine's values of interdisciplinary and collaborative research. He regularly and naturally collaborates across schools and programs on this campus. His thoughtfulness, generosity, and supportive nature make him an ideal leader of new programs, grants, and innovations. Dr. Magaziner has a strong interest and ability in developing future researchers and teachers. He's a valued mentor for many students, trainees, and faculty. He has nurtured many careers, partly through his leadership of the NIH T32 grant. So, in summary, Dr. Magaziner is truly a remarkable colleague, a distinguished scholar, and an effective leader. And lastly, a major asset to the School of Medicine and the university. Now it is with immense pride and great delight that I introduce to you my colleague and friend, Dr. J. Magaziner, the 2020 UMB Researcher of the Year. Congratulations, Dr. Magaziner. Well deserved indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dean Reese. Can you send that to me? I'd like to put that up on my wall. I don't know that I recognize myself by all the things you said about me, but thank you very much. I really appreciate your introduction, and all your support over so many years have really made it possible to do the things that I and others that I work with have been able to accomplish. I'm truly honored to have received this award, and want to thank my colleagues Andrew Ribaldini, Denise Orwig, and Joella Trenchard in the Division of Gerontology of the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health for thinking of nominating me, and for soliciting nominating letters from other colleagues at the university, elsewhere in the US and internationally, and to President Jarrell and his team for selecting me. Thank you, Dr. Jarrell. When Dr. Jarrell made an appointment to talk with me about 6 weeks ago, I assumed he wanted to ask if someone in my department could help with some aspect of the COVID-19 pandemic, which he had occasionally made requests for. I was wrong, and he surprised me completely. He told me about this award, which is really very special and really means a lot to me, and was really a complete surprise. So thank you to everyone. Now, figuring out what to talk about was a challenge, and delivering a lecture, a big lecture, especially because the audience is really quite diverse, and I can't see anybody or hear anyone. So I really don't know any reactions that I'm getting from the audience. So I will do my best to bring a picture that's fairly broad and fairly, something that everyone can understand. I chose a topic that was related to my own work over the past 35 to 40 years, and decided to show some of the findings, as well as some of the background on how an interdisciplinary scientist who grew up with an older family member, received training in gerontology and life sciences, and then in epidemiology, and how I put all of this together to actually try to accomplish something when I came to the University of Maryland in 1982. And with that, let me open up my slides here and share the screen. Okay, so I believe you can see that. Alex, are we all seeing that?
Yes, we are.
Okay, so the title of my talk is Hip Fracture Recovery, Past Research and Directions for Future Research and Practice. Here are my disclosures, which I include in all talks that I give. And this talk is dedicated to my grandfather, Grandpa Harry Cohn. Now, let me tell you a little about Grandpa Harry. He lived with us, I think since I was about 5 years old, though I do remember spending time with him before that. And I have wonderful memories of all the years we spent together, going places, talking. And then as he got older, I got to watch how he aged, how he developed chronic diseases, had various acute events, had a heart attack. Eventually he had a hip fracture while I was in graduate school. So he's really had a big influence on a lot of the work that I have done over the many years that I've been trying to understand what happens to people after hip fracture and how we can help them improve outcomes. Now, what I'm going to try to do in the next 30 minutes is give you an overview of the problem, talk about some of the evidence from a program of work that we call the Baltimore Hip Studies, and talk about some of the consequences of hip fracture, patterns of recovery, and then talk about some promising areas for interventions. And then I'm going to talk about how this information informs the direction for future research and targets for future interventions that really need attention. So currently, there are 1.6 million hip fractures worldwide. In the United States, there are 290,000 per year. Most are in older women. And globally, we're expecting there to be almost 4 million hip fractures by the year 2050. Tell you a little about the Baltimore Hip Studies, which is where the information I'll be talking about comes from. It's got a simple goal to identify, develop, and evaluate strategies to optimize recovery from hip fracture. Over the past 35 years, we've enrolled well over 4,000 hip fracture patients. We've studied a range of outcomes from mortality, functional recovery, changes in bone and muscle, the effects on caregivers, the effects on the healthcare system, and costs of care. The studies have progressed from simple observational studies. I don't mean to say they're simple, from observational studies to interventional studies. They were anything but simple at the time. And the studies have had multiple principal investigators and collaborators in Baltimore and elsewhere, and they've had outstanding graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and research staff. This is not something that I would have done alone or could possibly have done alone. It was the result of many people collaborating to make for a program that has yielded some useful information, I hope. So let me give you some research overview for a few minutes and tell you that I started back in 1983. I don't think anyone who was working on with me at the time is still at the university. Started doing some observational studies of hip fracture patients and some phone interviews of them, learned some things about their recovery. And what made it exciting for me is that nobody had ever done this before. So whatever I found was new. Later, we said we needed to dig deeper and see what would happen as people recovered and start measuring them more carefully. And we started going to their homes to measure them because we didn't believe that within a few days of a hip fracture, patients would come downtown to the medical center for evaluations. So we went to their homes, developed some portable instrumentation, a portable laboratory for going to their homes, and successfully continue to use that general approach, though we've certainly improved on our measures. We said, what's going on beneath the skin? We know how people walk now. We know how they can do certain things that we can observe, but what's going on with regard to their muscles and bones? We know that they were involved in leading to a hip fracture. So how are they involved in the recovery process? And we wanted to learn about that. And then at that point, in around the mid-1990s, I started thinking, we've learned a lot, we've observed a lot, but we really need to figure out what we can do about it. So at that point, a group of us started talking about the kinds of interventions we could undertake. Now, at the time, I was fortunate. I was working with Dr. Goldberg in the Department of Medicine, who headed a program, and we did work closely together for many years and continue to work together till today. But he was doing work on exercise, and he was very much committed to programs and exercise, which I didn't know a lot about. So I needed to see how that worked. I didn't have to, but I wanted to see how that approach to intervening might be used with a group that I was starting to learn a lot about, and started to develop some exercise programs that might improve people's outcomes. Now, unlike the approach that Dr. Goldberg was taking at the time, where patients would come into the medical center and do interventional work in their gym, because I really didn't believe I was going to get these women to come into the gym 2 or 3 times a week for exercise, I decided we needed to take something out to them in their homes. So we developed a program that would do that. We also worked with Barbara Resnick closely in the School of Nursing, who had developed strategies for motivating older patients to be engaged in physical activities. So together, we put together 2 projects, and one tested motivational strategies and one tested the actual effects of the exercise. Another colleague did some work on pressure ulcers after hip fracture, found that about 35% of patients who entered a hospital without a pressure ulcer within 20 days had developed a pressure ulcer, which is a rather profound number when you think of the problems of people being lying in bed for a few days in the hospital and then going home and not doing a lot to be active. Another reason that we want to move people and help them move around. And then we learned more about some observational work we decided to take on, looking at women and men. We knew a lot about women who had hip fractures, and now we decided to begin looking at men who had hip fractures, recognizing, and I think there was a growing interest in the general medical community as well as the research community in osteoporosis in men, which had not been given a lot of attention up until the early 2000s. So we've done a lot of work with that I'll show you in a few minutes. And last, the most recent large project that we undertook was a study of community ambulation, figuring that it's not enough to look at people and whether they can walk fast enough. We wanted to know if they would walk fast enough to be able to walk independently in the community. So this project, which I'll tell you about in a few minutes, was another attempt to take things into people's homes and see if we could improve their outcomes. A little bit more background on a hip fracture. Now, this is the hip area here, and when you get a break, you get it in here, and you get it in here, a little bit down there. So anywhere in here can break. And what it takes to have a hip fracture are 2 things: weak bones and some kind of trauma. It's very basic information. If you have something and you put a force on it, and whatever you're putting the force on isn't strong enough to withstand it, it breaks. So the hip is a vulnerable joint, the way it's structured here. There's no supporting structure in here. It's just a right angle in there. It's pretty vulnerable. And when there's a break, it's because of weak bones and something that leads to a fall, or the actual fall. But then you have to say what led to the fall. That's a whole other line of work that I'm not going to talk about today. So some of the consequences of hip fracture, we learned early on that there is mortality, but as many people have thought hip fracture as being the beginning of the end, in fact, hip fracture is not necessarily the beginning of the end. It's worse for men. About somewhere between 25 and 30% of men do die within a year after hip fracture, whereas about 15% of women die. One of the reasons is that men are usually sicker when they have a fracture than women are, and it's that illness together with the hip fracture that seems to carry them to a point of not surviving. Still, many do survive, and I'm going to tell you more about those individuals as we go forward here. There are changes in body composition and inflammation after a hip fracture. Body composition-wise, looking at lean mass, which is a way of looking at muscle, some aspects of muscle. And what we can see here, and the black line represents men and the red line represents women. What we can see is if they're at a particular point right after their fracture, when we first measure them, we see that over the course of 6 months, they lose somewhere between 2.5% and 3% of their lean body mass. They regain a little bit over the next few months, but in essence, the hip fracture has reduced the amount of lean mass, the amount of muscle that they've got available to them. They also lose a lot of bone mineral density. The information that we typically get from a DEXA machine. I remember this study we set up in 2 local hospitals, and at the time, it was a while ago, we had to actually purchase DEXA equipment for one of the hospitals because they didn't have it. But they were very, very willing to take it on and do the study with us. And we found, to our great surprise, that in women, they lost almost 3% of their bone mineral density by 2 months and about 4.5% by a year. Now, remember, these women are mostly osteoporotic or just a little bit shy of being osteoporotic at the time of fracture because they had weak bones in order to fracture. And now you're seeing that they lose bone within that very short period of time. There was also an inflammatory response, which at the time, people were not thinking about inflammation and cytokine levels, which now are a big area that there's a tremendous amount of work going on now. I believe we have a center here where we're looking at issues related to inflammation. It's going on in multiple centers within the School of Medicine. And we're learning that the inflammation has effects throughout the whole body. It's not just, and it's a result of some kind of insult that we're still trying to unbundle. What we find is that it's an immediate reaction, and it does help with the healing process, but it is also sustained long beyond the initial healing period and has other effects. Now, what about the impact of the hip fracture on function? Okay, so think about a person having a hip fracture. At the time of the hip fracture, they can't do any of these things. A person who's had a hip fracture cannot climb 5 stairs, cannot walk a block or walk 10 feet, cannot even put on their pants. So how do they look a year later? 20% still can't put on their pants independently. Basic function, 40% still can't walk independently. Getting in and out of a bath independently, 80% still can't do that. And very few can climb 5 stairs independently. So there's a tremendous impact on these areas of function, which are very basic to being able to carry on in the world without special guidance and assistance. So knowing that there are a lot of changes, what we wanted to know then is, what's the pattern by which people recover their function after a hip fracture? So we started to map out that recovery path, or what we call a trajectory of recovery. And here you can see, I've shown 4 functions: walking a block, rising from a chair, walking 10 feet, or getting in and out of bed, basic functions. And what you can see is they all recover to different levels. They recover to different levels, and they also have a different rate of recovery. So a function such as walking a block has a very gradual return, and 40% of the patients are able to walk a block a year later. And it takes a year to actually work up to being able to walk that block on average. And that's the point that they plateau. There's no longer recovery for that group after 12 months. Whereas a function like rising from a chair, if they're going to be able to do it, they can do it by 6 months. And about half are able to do that independently by about 6 months. The others, now this is when we actually test them, whether they have to use their arms and use the arms of a chair to prop themselves up. That doesn't mean they're disabled. It just means they have a functional limitation with regard to being able to actually stand up from a chair. So what you see is that different functions recover differently. Show you a few other functions. Something like gait speed is interesting. In order to be able to cross a street before a typical traffic light changes on a urban street, you need to be walking on average about 0.8 meters per second. Well, at the time of a hip fracture, of course, people are not walking at all. And by 2 months, women are walking at a speed of about 0.35, 0.37 meters per second. That's less than half of what it would take to cross the street. And if you follow the women on to 6 months, they're still not walking a heck of a lot faster, but they did improve some, and then they level off. They don't seem to improve much more after that. Whereas the men who survive continue to improve. They meet up with where women were by 6 months, and they continue to improve a bit more. But still, they're not walking at a very quick pace. And one of the latter studies that I'm going to show you, we try to address that with a home exercise program, and I'll come back to that. There's also other functional changes that take place after a fracture. There's depression. This is a very interesting and important factor which interferes with motivation, willingness to get better, willingness to engage, can be affected. And there's a high level of depressive symptoms right after a fracture, which seems expectable, given the insult and the belief that many people have about the ultimate endpoint for them having a hip fracture. There's a resolution of these symptoms by 2 months, and there's not a lot of change after that in women. And with men, there's even more resolution. That may be because of the way men report emotions and symptom reports. I think the message here is that there's a spike with depressive symptoms for everyone, and that it does resolve, but it's still some people, about 25% it turns out, do continue to have depressive feelings, and those people do the most poorly in the long run. There's also social interaction that changes. This happens to be on a scale, and this is where the level in social interaction that hip fracture patients were at prior to their fracture, as opposed to right after their fracture. And what we found is that women are more socially engaged than men, but they both had a reasonable amount of social activity before their fracture. Within that 2-month period, there's really a big drop-off in social activity, and then there's some recovery of it. So again, there are changes with recuperation. There's a plateau. They continue to improve up to about a year. So there's a plateau later on. Now what we did is we took this information, and for each function, we tried to determine where what I call natural recovery occurred, where they actually reached this plateau, okay? And for each function, there was a different plateau. So that's the recovery they could achieve had they not had any special interventions. Most people had some physical therapy, a few weeks, maybe a month or two after their fracture. But after that, most physical therapy drops off. Now here I've looked at the sequence of recovery. So what happens is people recover with regard to their depressive symptoms, their cognitive abilities, memory, concentration abilities. If they're going to recover, they recover by about 4 months. Later, they recover some of these underlying factors which help propel them to walk, for example, and stand up and move around. And those are changes in balance and gait come later. And following that, what happens is there are changes in higher level functions like social activities, instrumental tasks like using the telephone or paying bills or going to the grocery store. And their lower extremity functions like walking, bathing, and dressing, they recover also later. So there seems to be this progression in how people recover. And this progression sort of it parallels, or it's a reverse parallel of a process by which people lose function. Now, there's a model that people talk about as a disablement model. It's been updated by the World Health Organization with more arrows in it, but I thought I would use the older model, which I think is a little easier to take in, where a person has pathology, whether it's congestive heart failure or whatever their pathology is. Over time, that has the potential to lead to impairments, and those impairments can lead to functional limitations and disability. Well, what I started to think about is how can we look at that in reverse? So there's pathology, which is osteoporosis and the various chronic conditions that might lead one to have a fracture or to fall in the first place. There's a recovery from the impairment. Now, you have to use your imagination a little bit here in mapping these words onto each other. But in essence, we fix a person's hip with surgical procedures and some orthogeriatric care or anesthesia management. We do as we can in the hospital to get them so their bones are fixed. And we do that so they can eventually get up and walk again. And then we try to deal with neuromuscular functions of gait and balance. We try to address issues related to their cognition and affective status. And eventually what we want to do is we want to change how they function, how their social function is, their lower extremity functions are, which are built on all of these other things having taken place. I don't believe you're going to see an improvement in lower extremity function unless you repair a person's hip, or unless you actually improve neuromuscular function, reduce cognitive problems, and affective status being better. So we need to be working toward that progression. Now, let me talk about interventions and their timing. There's a general progression or loss of function as a person gets older. With a hip fracture, there's a sudden loss of function. There's a process of recovery, a natural process or pattern of recovery. And ultimately, what we want to do is we want to get in there and do things to get people closer to where they would have been had they not had a fracture. And if you follow the progression that I showed you a few seconds ago, I don't think it was very long, you can see that there are possible treatments for each of these. So that becomes a whole package of things that can be delivered in an orderly way as a person recovers. Sounds easy, it sounds very straightforward, but in our healthcare systems, it simply is not being done for a whole range of reasons, which I'd be happy to talk about at another time. But there are many well-trained people out there in our medical and professional armamentarium that can actually make a difference here if we can put them together in a logical, sequential way. So we know a lot about the losses. We have trained professionals, and we just don't know what's going to make the biggest difference. But we do have to keep trying while we're trying to figure out what actually makes the most difference. So some evidence and a strategy for the future. The first, we did these two studies of exercise that I want to tell you about before I close. And one was a feasibility study that we did to determine the feasibility and the preliminary efficacy of a year-long home-based exercise intervention for community-dwelling hip fracture patients. What we did here is we enrolled 180 women, and we actually took an exercise program this was delivered by an exercise trainer who was trained to deliver motivational strategies at the same time as they were delivering the actual exercise with patients in their homes. And we measured them as we were going ahead for a year. And these are some of the exercises that we included. There were flexibility exercises that people could do with the trainer, but they also could do it on their own without harming themselves. They also had strength training with TheraBands, and they did some step-up exercises to do some aerobic training. Not all that intense, but safe. There was a lot of issues on safety. What could you legitimately take into a person's home when most exercise programs were delivered in a gym under very strict medical guidance? So we couldn't deliver the same intensity in a person's home that we would deliver in a clinical setting or in an exercise facility. And we found, and Dr. Orwig did a very nice job of finding that and reported on the fact that when they were enrolled in the study and started their intervention, both the exercise group, which is in white, and the control group, which had usual care, were about the same in the amount of activity they engaged in. But over the course of a year, actually by 2 months, after they started the intervention, we actually saw much more activity in the exercise group than in the control group. And that persisted through the entire year. So we knew we could deliver the intervention, and we knew that we could improve activity. Unfortunately, we didn't show any major gains in their functional ability. We didn't really improve their speed of walking or their ability to walk a block or do the kinds of things that were important. But we did have an impact at this level. At the same time that we were doing this study, a colleague at Washington University was also involved in a study where she actually brought people into a clinical center and had a very intensive program that she was delivering in an exercise facility. And she did this over a shorter period of time, and actually we're using the same program now in another study that we're in the middle of, that I'm not going to talk about today. But this project actually was very, at the same time we said, wow, maybe we could do something like that. Well, what Ellen Binder found was that there was actually an improvement in function on a scale called the Modified Physical Performance Scale. So it was a scale made up of multiple functions, and those that were in the high intensity group did better than those in the comparison group. So the question that we then wanted to ask is, can you translate this center-based intensity to a home setting? It was a challenge. It took a long time with a lot of very creative physical therapists working with us. A group from Arcadia University worked with us on this, as well as consults with the Pepper Center investigators and people in our PTRS department to actually try to develop the program where we could try to translate this exercise. So we had 210 patients that we randomized across 3 sites. One was in Maryland. And we used this multimodal exercise intervention. So we delivered exercise, plus we gave nutritional intervention, calcium and vitamin D. So we wanted to basically give them everything we knew about that might help in addition to exercise. So we had 2 groups, and we wanted to compare these 2 groups. And we had 210 patients, and the 2 groups we called push and pulse. And they each got 32 physical therapy visits over 16 weeks, and they were measured at 16 and 40 weeks after they started the intervention. And the first intervention we called push, and I think you'll see why in a moment. And here we wanted to use a very force production, endurance, and balance training. We really wanted to get everything we possibly could to them in their homes, up to a level that would be safe and that patients could actually do in their homes. And this is one of the exercises. We took a shuttle device into their homes, and they had to push against this device, and there are bands in there that you can't see. And as people progressed, we could actually make the amount that they had to push greater, so we could change the tension on this pedal. and we could change the direction of that. So we could work on different muscle groups with this device. We also walked with them to increase their heart rate, and we were quite good at improving heart rate. So there was some aerobic benefit in terms of heart rate and exercise with them. And they also had to get up from a chair and up from the floor, things that one might have to do in daily life. We really wanted to do some functional training with them and improve their balance at the same time. The non-specific intervention we called pulse, and the reason is we used active range of motion, but we used transcutaneous electrical stimulation, or a pulse, to work on pain and improve muscle recruitment, contraction of muscle. And here are some of the stretching exercises, probably familiar to most of you, whether you do it in a chair or whether you, do it standing on a 10-foot pole. People are probably familiar with this. And here's where we place the electrodes for the transcutaneous electrical stimulation. And this was done with a licensed physical therapist in their home. We didn't feel that we could send an exercise trainer into their home, someone that you'd work with in a typical gym in a community center, because they may not be equipped to deliver the same kind of tension or the same kind of safety issues that would be important for these patients in their homes. And what did we find? Well, we found that we wanted them to pass a threshold of being able to walk 300 meters in 6 minutes. What that means is they could walk 0.8 meters a second, essentially, over a period of time. So they had to have some aerobic capacity as well as be able to cross the street. So they had to be doing pretty well. Well, 22% of those who could not do it when we started our study, when we started intervening, from the push group could do it, whereas 17.8 or 18% could do it if they were in the pulse group. The difference of 5.1, the difference is 5.1%, and it was not statistically significant, but there is still an absolute difference that one could consider important. If the study were larger, we might have had a different outcome. There are a lot of reasons. Our control group, which we're assessing now, our control group actually got a physical therapist in their home for as many times and for as long a period, doing hands-on activities with them. Maybe our control group was almost as good as the all the exercises we asked them to do. We simply don't know, which is what I was saying. We need to do more to learn what's going to have the biggest impact. So let me summarize quickly. We know that there's an increase in hip fractures ahead, even if we develop the magic bullet with regard to bone strengthening or prevention of falls. I would venture a guess we're still going to see a lot of hip fractures in the next 30 years. There's a lot of functional loss with a hip fracture. There's an inflammatory response. There's excess mortality, loss of bone, loss of muscle, increase in body fat. There seems to be an orderly sequence by which recovery and function occurs. The sequence seems to parallel a process by which function is lost, and treatments and interventions need to be targeted to the underlying diseases and the emerging consequences of those diseases and of the fracture. For some future directions, I believe that multidisciplinary, multimodal interventions have the potential to improve long-term outcomes. We need to identify the components of these interventions that can make a difference. We need to design programs and use them in a combined manner. And we need to figure out a way to do this more quickly than we're doing it now. Each of these studies can take several years to mount. So we either need a proliferation of scientists going after this, and we're starting to see a tremendous, well, I'd say an increasing number of scientists around the world who are pursuing interventional studies after hip fracture. And what we need is a strategy to do this even more quickly. So I'll leave you with this to say that as care delivery changes to improve outcomes and reduce costs, which is something that most care systems around the world are concerned about, we need to design and evaluate the efficacy and cost effectiveness of patient-focused, need-based interventions that can be implemented in new and emerging care delivery systems. So even if we get the best intervention, we still have to figure out how we're going to deliver it so those patients who need it can actually receive it. And I want to acknowledge several people. These are people who coordinated these studies over the many years. These were, for the most part, people who came here early in their careers and have advanced a lot. I'm not going to go through what each of them has wound up doing, but they've all excelled in their own way after they spent a few years coordinating these projects and working with me intellectually and practically in running these projects. And in fact, Dr. Orwig now leads the Baltimore Hip Studies. So she was smart enough, or not, depending on how she sees it, to stay around for quite a while. These also are some of my longtime collaborators. Dr. Hochberg and Orwig have been co-principal investigators with me for many, many years. Dr. Gruber Baldini is the senior analyst. Justine Golden is our senior data manager, and Mary Louise Fine is our head nurse. Other acknowledgements include the many people and patients that have been involved with me and involved with the programs over the years, the providers, the hospitals, and the National Institute on Aging. I also want to thank my family, who I acknowledge. This is my family in the 90s when we were all not thinking about getting older. And this is my family today when some of us do think about getting older. Some still don't think about it, I'm sure. And this is Grandpa Harry, and thank you very much to everyone for listening. Alex?
All right, well, your presentation has provoked a number of questions. You can stop sharing there. We're going to go to Wendy Cates, who will have the first question. Wendy, go ahead. I've unmuted you.
I wondered, Jay, well, thank you for this excellent presentation. And I wondered to what extent recovery of ADL function was associated with age at hip fracture.
That's a very good question. Yes, so I'm not sure that it's the age per se, as well as the underlying conditions that people have at the time. And since age seems to stand in for a lot of chronic conditions, what we do see is that people that are older have a slower path to recovery.
All right, David Marin has two questions if we have time. David, are you there?
Yeah, so my first question, Dr. Magaziner, is can you discuss the ways your epidemiology training has provided benefits or value added to your research program compared to how it might have progressed if you hadn't had the epi training? So what unique insights do you think epi training brought to your work?
Yeah, that's a great question, David. I think that what it did is it gave me a framework and a set of ways of looking at different types of studies. And what I often see is that people do the studies, but they don't have a framework of how they might progress from a simple observation all the way to developing strategies for intervening, and then using study methods that fit within each of those types of studies that we hope are true to rigorous studies that can be reproduced by others. So it's a framework, and then of course some techniques and some thinking about needing to worry about outcomes at the time that you design your study, etc. And I know I'm speaking to the converted, so I'm going to stop because I've probably said enough, and you probably know more than I do.
David, you have a second question?
Sure. So I can imagine that the trajectories of loss and recovery are very different for different pre-fracture health and functional status levels. And do you find that the intervention effectiveness is also different when that's for groups that are very different on their pre-fracture status? And is that really difficult to sort out in the research, knowing that effect modification is sometimes the hardest thing to study?
Yeah, well, we've done this and we've tried to do it. The statistical power, talk about epidemiologic principles, goes down as we start splitting our samples. But you know, it's interesting. What winds up happening is when we intervene with people that are more frail, they seem to have more recovery from the point they're at, and that's maybe because they're at a lower point to start. But in the end, they don't get as far as those that were doing better at the time that we start intervening with them. But the differences tend to be a little greater, at least the kinds of interventions we've used, with those that are a bit frailer or more fragile.
Lori Anderson has the next question. Lori, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, Dr. Magaziner. Thank you so much for such a great presentation. And I really felt that sort of connection that in your sharing of dedicating this to your grandfather and how much he's inspired you. And I really appreciated your sentiment on that. My question is that in understanding that older adults have a number of different comorbidities, are there different recovery recommendations or experiences that you've had for hip fracture patients who have had a stroke or are living with Alzheimer's disease?
Boy, what are my recommendations? My recommendations are, if you're a family member, regardless, my recommendation is that you should not exclude people who have had a stroke or have cognitive problems. I think the level of cognitive problem might dictate what you do, but I do believe that all of these people can benefit from physical activity and some kind of movement after a fracture. It may not be perceptible or to the point of crossing a street independently, but not lying in bed and not sitting in a chair and moving in general can be beneficial. Often what happens is people that are very impaired don't get the same kind of attention in physical therapy as they should. And it may be because they don't show the kind of progression that's needed in order to justify the kind of reimbursement that's needed to continue it. But I believe it could be valuable. We've tried to study that. It's a very difficult group to study. And there are some studies going on in different parts of the world doing more with the people with cognitive problems, which could be from mild Alzheimer's disease. But I haven't seen a lot of work done with stroke patients, but it probably would depend on the kind of disabilities that they have.
All right, Doctor, we have an anonymous questioner. The questioner writes, are these findings the same for hip replacements as opposed to fractures?
No. Hip replacements are, well, there's a general pattern of recovery after a hip replacement. There haven't been as many studies as you might have thought after hip replacement, though it turns out that in talking to many orthopedists, one of their biggest concerns is, are people going to fall again after their hip replacement? And we don't know a lot. We do know that some do fall, and we need to work on that. The pattern of recovery, there is a pattern after it, but we've not mapped it in the same way. And those who have hip replacements are generally healthier and younger. And it's an elective procedure and is often not, it's not made available as readily to people that are older and frailer.
Great. We have just a few more questions. Ralph Brown is with us. Ralph? Go ahead. You're open.
I just was wondering, you showed the recovery rate for people in terms of how far they could walk and how often they could get out of, how easy it was to get out of a chair. But were you able to have a sense of what level of function they had before the fracture? So in order to be able to assess the percentage of recovery compared to what they were at before the fracture?
Yes. In fact, Ralph, you might have missed it. I'm sure I went too quickly. The way we assess that, unfortunately, we haven't figured out how to measure them just before their fracture to see what they would have been like. Although there are some longitudinal studies that have information in the months or year before a fracture. But what we've done in our studies is we ask them how they were doing in certain basic tasks, or talk to a family member, a surrogate responder, about how they were doing. So we are able to show how they do compared to what they were like beforehand. So about 40% of patients, for example, who were able to walk on their own before a fracture now need some assistance a year later. So we did do those kind of comparisons.
Oh, great. Next question comes from Lisa Schulman. Lisa, are you there?
Oh, hi, Lisa.
Yeah, hi Jay. An incredible body of work over such a long period of time, and it's very, very persistent, asking question after question. And this may be a difficult question for you, but are there any clever strategies that can be used to speed the pace of discovery for such an important problem?
Can you ask that question again? I'm not sure I understand it.
Are there any strategies that can be applied that could speed the pace of discovery? Because when you do these painstaking trials, one after another, it takes years and years to get answers.
So are there any discoveries to overcome that painstaking?
Are there any trial strategies to go faster?
Yeah, all we need is a lot of money to do that, which has been hard to come by for this. But I believe, and I've tried to put together an international network that has actually would actually have a whole group of people that were willing to take studies on that would answer specific questions more readily and more quickly. The problem with that has been that when they're within the US, I haven't found enough investigators that want to take that on. And when we go international, there's a lot of interest, but everyone needs to get funding from their own country to do it. So it's a challenge that I haven't taken on, but I would challenge anyone to take that on, and I'd be happy to work with them. Lisa, are you interested?
I'm sorry, Lisa. I
asked Lisa if she wanted to take it on.
Okay, hold on. I'll get her back.
No, that's okay.
Lisa, you want to answer that?
I was going to say to Jay, I'm always ready to be his collaborator.
Okay.
Thank you, Lisa. It's a big list, but I think that's exactly what we need. We need something.
We're at 5 o'clock, but we do have just a couple more questions if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
Okay, great. Rosemary Kozar. Rosemary, are you there?
Yeah. Jay, great talk. Thank you so much. Brent's father died shortly after having his fixed about a year or so ago, so I listened intently to your talk. But as I was listening, some of the things you talked about with the lack of functional recovery over time sort of made me think about a lot of the trauma patients I take care of. And I'm wondering your thoughts on some of the strategies you've developed for the elderly with an isolated hip fracture, if you think they can be applied to, say, younger, multiply injured patients, in terms of some of the things with the exercise and all the things that you've been working on. It just seemed that's, we still have these patients that suffer from a lot of the same issues.
I agree. I do believe, Rosemary, that can be done. In fact, one of our faculty, Jennifer Albrecht, is working on things right along those lines. In fact, I'm reviewing a proposal of hers right now, which you probably are part of, which actually is trying to look at the kinds of functional changes that take place. Yeah. And I believe she's working with a couple of people from our PTRS department, Physical Therapy and Rehab Sciences department. And we recruited a new person, and she's working with them to actually look at how we can develop some exercise and activity trials with those patients. I think it's incredibly important.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, our next question comes from Hoshin Zhu. Let me just bring your mic up here a moment. Go ahead.
Hi, Jay. Excellent talk. I have a question on whether the recovery differ among different surgery team or facilities, or by different type of surgery those patients underwent.
You know, it's interesting. It's interesting. Surprisingly, what we do find is that people who get a partial hip or a total hip replacement, they do walk a bit sooner, but over 6 months or a year, there's no difference. So we do get them up and walking a bit sooner with a actual prosthesis put in. And of course, some hips just don't warrant it, can't justify it. But yes, there is slight difference in terms of the timing of recovery.
All right, very good. Dana Bradley has our next question. Dana, are you there?
I am. Hey, so greetings from your colleagues.
Pardon me, Dana, you may need to speak up just a little bit.
I can't hear right.
Can you hear me? Right?
No, I can't, but maybe Alex could repeat the
Well, I can relay. Go ahead and ask your question, and if Dr. Magaziner has a problem, I'll relay it.
I was just giving greetings from our colleagues at University of Maryland, Baltimore County. So congratulations, Jay. Help us think about, so this is a tipping point, right? People have a hip fracture. So let's go back to that initial point in time. And for many people who are not in the clinical setting, they seem to see this as a make or break time in older adults' life. What data do you have in thinking about how we could collect more data and help move the discussion forward so that this moment in time could be seen as a pause and one that isn't necessarily setting back older adults, but it's part of the perhaps their natural.
Okay, I'm going to ask if Alex can rephrase some of that.
Well, let me
I couldn't quite
read you the short version that Dana wrote. She's asking about how we frame the debate. Now, which would inform future funding that might see hip fractures as a tipping point in terms of healthcare and monies invested. So how do we frame that debate?
How do we frame that debate? Well, we try to frame that debate. I would try to frame that debate in terms of the ultimate saving in terms of dollars, because that seems to be particularly important these days, and it's always been important, but in terms of quality of life, and it's always that trade-off between quality of life and cost to achieve that. But even with more money, if we can't do things that can actually improve quality, we shouldn't be going after those. So the debate would be framed in a way that says we need more information in order to be able to know what would really make a difference. And then we need to actually test it in a larger system way, like within a big healthcare system or in some way in a large population to see whether we actually had an impact. That's the quick answer to something I hadn't thought about as much as you have, Dana.
Okay, Vincent Conroy has this question. Vincent, go ahead.
Hey,
Go ahead,
Dr. Magaziner, thanks for a great talk.
Thank you.
I just got to see what my question was. I wrote it quite a while ago and actually have to depart for another meeting. But as future older generations become more comfortable with technology, do you anticipate an increase in innovative use of telemedicine rehab to assist this rehab process? If
Yes.
so, okay. And then if so, what do you envision this model to look like?
Well, as you probably know, Dr. Zhang and Dr. Mako are working on some advanced technologies to improve rehabilitation. And they're not just replacement technologies, they're actually technologies that can help people actually use their limbs to ambulate and keep pressing them to continue to do it at higher and higher levels. So that's a robotic approach to actually seeing improvement. And they're in a real development phase and are making a lot of progress in that. That's a big part of our upcoming Pepper Center that we're hoping we'll be able to see outcomes from.
All right, thank you, Doctor. You've been very generous with your time. Do you have any final words, or
No,
anything you want to add to that?
No, I'm just honored and pleased to be able to talk about things that I feel are quite important and something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. So this is a great pleasure for me, and I hope others have enjoyed hearing some of it.
Well, they obviously have, and everyone has been very anxious to ask you questions, and obviously got a lot out of that presentation. So thank you, and thank you to our audience for joining us for UMB's 2020 Researcher of the Year presentation.